Lawyer Sadat Haruna Alhassan, are you a member of the GBA?
Let me say a very good morning to you.
Good
Your
morning.
cherished
Good morning.
and a very good morning to your good self.
Yes, and a happy new year to you too.
Happy many returns.
I wanted to find out whether you're a member of the GBA.
Okay, thank you. I'm not just a member, but a member in good standing.
Not just a member, but a member in good standing.
Exactly. And so that is that I have a certain capacity in that situation.
But you're also a member of Lean Sort, Lawyers in Search of Democracy.
Exactly.
I see. Very interesting. So I guess then you must agree with your former president of the bar that this proposal to replace the GBA with an appointee of the president choice of a senior lawyer is something that should not happen, because essentially it has worked. There's no problem with it. Nobody has ever come to say the GBA rep on our board or our governing institution has not done a good job. What do you say to that? Do you agree with him?
Okay. First and foremost, we must understand the context within which those statements were made. I'll take it that the statements were made having taken into account the current political space. Originally, the GBA was established primarily to be a watchdog of democracy within our government space, which meant that anything that was supposed to be done in a manner required by law needed to be done within that context. And that anything that any government or leader at any given point in time needed to do and will more or less attempt to circumvent certain procedural matters. The GBA had a responsibility as a sole legal body to bring the government to check. It means that it must respond. It must always be on the alert and respond to matters that will seek to undermine our rule of law, our democratic governance as a complete structure. Now, the question should be whether it has successfully executed this mandate, especially in the last 8 years. We saw the GBA did under the John Mahama administration, and then we saw what it did under the Nana Akufo-Addo administration. And so that's why I'm saying that the whole issue must be seen from a purely holistic perspective, given the context in which the statement was made. Which means that even as a former leader of the bar, you are required to demonstrate some level of independence of mind, impartiality, and true leadership, and speaking to authority when it needs or requires you to do so. Now, when you speak in a manner making it look like the current Constitutional Review Commission has undertaken a work and largely influenced by an agenda of an NDC, such a statement leaves much to be desired, especially coming from a former president of the bar. Could it also be said, that by making that statement, you are also projecting a certain agenda of an MPP, a political party? If you accuse that it is an NDC agenda, could it also be the case that you are also now reacting based on a certain MPP agenda? And you can see clearly he himself is a pure political personality within the MPP, except to say that it was just clouded in the name of leading the association as a bar of lawyers. In the very few weeks, if you monitor closely, you will agree with me that that is purely a certain MPP agenda he might be pursuing, or is clearly pursuing, because he has just launched his full political aspirations to lead a certain either constituency or leadership level within the NPP as a political party.
So what you heard was a politician speaking the language of politics.
And that's why I said that that statement ordinarily will not come from a leader or a former leader of the bar. Your status doesn't change in terms of how you approach issues relating to governance. And so if you have now become a former leader of the bar, and you are now assuming a certain campaign managerial role to campaign for NPP, and then accusing other persons who have made very fantastic inputs into the Constitutional Review Commission's work, and now alluding that it is clearly NDC induced report. I mean, that's extremely unfortunate. Coming from somebody of that, if it were just somebody on the street saying it, I wouldn't have been bothered. But for somebody who has been a leader of the bar, under whose watch we saw the lowest point of rule of law, you never uttered a word against it. You only found solace in the fact that you were exiting office in Kumasi when you made the statements suggesting that Galamsey and other related issues that were sinking the nation, in fact, that had already sunk the nation, were not in good taste, and therefore the president and his team needed to sit up and confront these issues squarely. That was the only time throughout the 8-year period we were able to pinpoint and say it to the face of the president. And it was simply because the bashing was just too much. It became unbearable. And therefore you were compelled to do that. If you had your own, you would have more or less delegated your deputy or your vice to do that. So I'm saying that you cannot cloud yourself in the name of a GBA or a former president to make political statements and expect that the ordinary Ghanaian who is extremely discerning will not be able to read in between the lines. There's a huge difference between white and black. And therefore, for you to be posting that black color when you are not black but white, you can easily be seen. And so I don't see it as a very serious statement that requires an interrogation in terms of looking at the realities on the ground, whether those inputs made into the report are political or not.
I understand your point about him
to examine
him
especially where
speaking.
it's coming from.
Okay, I understand your point about he speaking a partisan language, but are you saying that he doesn't have a point when he suggests that if the arrangement has not in any way caused any damage, you have a situation of an association of lawyers having to nominate a member to governing boards among others, and so far it hasn't hurt anybody in any way. It should not be touched.
The question should be whether a research has been conducted from those institutions to establish the input or the effectiveness of those representations over there. Because if institutions are to be represented, or GB is to be represented in various institutions, you should rather be interested in finding out from those institutions the representation of GBA, and in the course of the representation, when critical matters came that affected the government of the day at the time, whether those people who represented GBA in those institutions were able to deal with them dispassionately. That should be the test. And so he himself he's aware, and that's why I'm saying try and do some survey. Verify from the heads of the various institutions where GBA was fully represented under the last regime. And you clearly even see that the representations were simply an MPP representation. And so anything wrong for them was right. Do you see any institution coming out or any representation from GBA in those institutions coming out publicly to say that, well, A, B, C, D took place and I disagree? No, go and look through whatever activities took place in those areas. And you come to the realization that it is simply an MPP representation and no longer a GBA representation. Because even when they are selecting those to represent, they will simply identify NPP elements and appoint them to represent the association over there. Should we allow this to happen? And in any case, why do you think in an era where there are several MDC or GBA in the form of GBA, so broadly speaking, where a number of lawyers groups have sprung out in the system, why should it be just one association representing lawyers in all institutions? It was simply the case because at the time it was the only association. And the premise of the Constitution knew that the GBA could not have just meant that it ousted every other legal association or lawyers association from being formed. No, it was generically used to say that the GBA representing lawyers as long as it's an association, not specifically referring to this existing GBA. But anytime lawyers associations were formed in line with the constitution, such a body ought to be recognized and therefore must have representation. So if we have developed as a state the constitution being seen as a living organism, you don't expect it to remain static where it was in 1993. It is no longer there. If you look at the various provisions of the constitution and most of the cases that you have at the Supreme Court relating to the provisions of the constitution, you clearly and undoubtedly see that the interpretation was made to give a certain perspective to reflect fairness in the system and equity in the system. That is the rationale for that provision. And so no lawyer should be construed to be an entitlement that it should be exclusively that GBA as described in the Constitution to mean the existing GBA as we have it. No. Even if we have 100 lawyers associations, the Constitution will recognize them and will require that representation is made from these associations to various institutions. However, the lawyers associations will come together to now form a union. That's another matter. If they choose to have selective representation, one from representation A, another from representation B, to represent institutions or to be on the board of institutions, representing the various associations, that's another architecture we can design. But the interpretation is that nobody should have that sense of entitlement that because it is this GBA that we now have clearly stated in the Constitution, it simply means that no other association of lawyers can be formed and therefore be recognized by the Constitution. That is a very defective and a very unfortunate interpretation of that provision. Clearly, you can see that those also rooting for the fact that it should be maintained as such and singled out as the only or the sole lawyers association are also MPP. Can't you make that logical argument? So let's diffuse it. It should be diffused. Okay. To have a representation, whether you are a crocodile, a bamboo tree, whatever, there must be an amalgamation of everybody. Okay. After all, we are simply a unitary state, one constitution, one nation, and therefore representation must be fairly done. So that is the way it should be interpreted. Rather than this political, I'm not interested in some of these political debates. You should rather be bringing people who are speaking in manner that ought to be interrogated and reasoned with. But when you bring political statements like this, it makes it very difficult to now advance a good cause. Because you are simply polarized to start with. As a former GBA president, it doesn't lie with you to determine which political party should have supremacy over the other in the Constitution. No. Because we are a beneficiary, that's why you are thinking that way. Other people also contested and even lost. Ask for their opinion. Because you were there and you won on the basis of a strong MPP campaign. They campaign for you, they saw you win. So of course you are justifying the support that they give you that enables you to win. Lawyer. That's the only argument he was simply trying to advance to please his party people and nothing more, nothing less. So let's rather talk about more serious matters.
Thank you. Thank you very much for speaking to us.
My pleasure.
Lawyer Sadat Haruna Alhassan is a member of the Ghana Bar Association. He said he's a member in good standing. So everybody who we've spoken to, in fact, Honorable Roxy Nelson is